Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, October 30th, 2023. All right, first story at the top of antiwar.com today, more attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. So attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria have continued through the weekend after the U.S. launched airstrikes in eastern Syria early Friday. So Lebanon's Al Mayadeen, media outlet based in Lebanon, they reported that a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq said that it successfully targeted the U.S.'s al-Shaddadi base in Syria, which is located in northeastern Syria's al-Hasaka province. And this was on Sunday that they claimed this attack. And the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK, they also reported a drone attack on the al-Shaddadi base. So it was reported by multiple sources. And their report said that explosions were heard in the area and that smoke columns rose from the base. Al Mayadeen also reported an overnight attack on a U.S. base in Syria's eastern Deir ez-Zor province. So these attacks that happened on Sunday have not yet been confirmed by the U.S. military. U.S. officials have confirmed to the Associated Press that a U.S. base in eastern Syria came under attack on Friday after the U.S. launched those airstrikes. And U.S. officials also said a drone was fired at the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq, which houses U.S. troops. And they say that drone was shot down. No casualties have been reported yet in these attacks, but again, I don't think we know the full picture yet. And another thing, I haven't seen any reports of casualties in the U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria, so we'll see if more comes out about that. But, you know, the U.S. is saying, the White House is saying one purpose of these airstrikes that they launched in eastern Syria was to deter further attacks. And I know I've talked about this before, but the U.S. has, under Biden, it happened a lot under Trump too, has launched airstrikes like this against the Shia militias in Iraq that operate in Iraq and Syria. And sometimes they respond, sometimes they back down. And I suspected with everything that's going on in Gaza that they weren't going to back down, and they haven't. And the White House is saying that the purpose of the strikes was to deter further attacks. Clearly, that is a failed strategy. So the U.S. said that its airstrikes in eastern Syria targeted facilities used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and affiliated groups, which refers to the Shia militias that operate in the region. The U.S. has not attributed the rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases to a specific group, but is blaming them on Iran, although there's no evidence that Tehran is directing the attacks. And this group that is taking credit for some of these attacks, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, I don't know much about them. I haven't heard that specific name until this recent flare-up. They're said to be an umbrella group of the Shia militias in Iraq, but it's not clear which ones are part of this group, because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of different militias. I know Kateb Hezbollah is a big one, but I haven't seen much from them. I know they were threatening things earlier on, but I don't think they're directly taking credit for attacks. But anyway, again, something I've been repeating is that these Shia militias are generally aligned with Iran and receive support from Iran, but they're not a monolith. Some of them do different things than others, and they are also known to be able to act independently. And a U.S. official recently told CNN that how willing these groups are to act independently is a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S. So that means the U.S. doesn't really know if Iran is directing these or how involved Iran is with these attacks. And a lot of these groups just want the U.S. out of Iraq. That's a big motive for their attacks. And they might be taking this opportunity hoping that maybe they could drive them out. But one thing that's concerning is regardless of, how involved Iran is, there are signs that the U.S. might take the fight directly to Iran if these attacks persist. And I guess in a way they already have, because they're saying that they bombed IRGC facilities inside Syria. So the New York Times reported that one message the U.S. was trying to send with its airstrikes on Friday was that, and I want to read the quote from the New York Times article, and this is based on their conversations with U.S. officials. It says one message is that, quote, if the attacks on American forces by Iranian proxies escalate, it will force the United States into the kind of overt military confrontation with Iran that both nations have avoided since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, end quote. So it sounds like the U.S. is threatening all-out war if these attacks persist. And the question is if Iran wants these attacks to persist, because I know in the past there's been times where they have told these groups to dial it back. And sometimes they don't listen. They don't all listen to Iran. But before the U.S. launched the airstrikes in Syria, the Pentagon said that at least 21 troops were injured in attacks on U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq. That started over Biden's support for Israel's onslaught in Gaza. And that was before the U.S. launched the airstrikes. And we'll see if more casualties come up, after these attacks over the weekend. I would suspect we'll probably see something from CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, on Monday about some of these attacks. We'll see. All right, so the next one here, bill to split Israel aid from Ukraine will be brought to the House floor. So newly elected House Speaker Mike Johnson said on Sunday that a standalone bill to provide Israel with billions more in military aid will be brought to the House floor this week, instead of President Biden's $105 billion request that also includes spending for Ukraine, Taiwan, and the border. So Johnson said on Fox News on Sunday morning, quote, "We're going to move a standalone Israel funding bill this week in the House. I know our Republican colleagues in the Senate have a similar measure," end quote. So a group of Senate Republicans introduced a bill to provide Israel with $14.3 billion in additional military aid, which is the same amount for Israel that Biden requested as part of that $105 billion. And Johnson has expressed support for continuing the proxy war in Ukraine, but he says that Israel is the priority. So Johnson said, quote, "We believe that it is a pressing and urgent need. There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will, but right now what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention, and I think we have got to separate that and get it through," end quote. And Johnson, I linked to an article from Haaretz here. He's an evangelical Christian with ties to people in Israel, and the evangelicals believe in all these these prophecies will come true, with certain things with Israel. So, very fanatic stuff. And that is a big part of why many people in the U.S. government support Israel so strongly. So Representative Michael McCaul, he's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He also said that a standalone Israel bill will be coming this week. And Johnson has previously voted against Ukraine aid packages, but he said in an interview this past Thursday night that he believes the U.S. should keep supporting the war. And I want to get more into that in this next article here from Kyle Anzalone. New House Speaker says Russia, China, and Iran are the new axis of evil. So we got a new speaker and we got a new axis of evil. So Johnson, and this was in an interview, I think, with Sean Hannity this past Thursday night. So he told Sean, it's right there. I should have just kept reading. He told Sean Hannity that China, Russia, and Iran make up an axis of evil that poses a huge threat to the U.S. So he said, quote, "Big priorities in this moment right now. We have Israel being attacked. We have unrest. We have the Ukraine situation we've got to deal with. We have China being aggressive. We have Iran with all the meddling, and China, Russia, and Iran working together. This is a dangerous time. Hamas and Hezbollah are proxies of Iran, and they're tied in now with Russia and China. I mean, it is a new axis of evil. That is how we see it," end quote. And claiming that these countries pose the biggest threat since World War II. And he also, again, supported continuing funding the proxy war in Ukraine. He said, quote, "Now we can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there." and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, end quote. So even though Mr. Johnson here got an F on his report card from the neocons over at that, what's it called? Republicans for Ukraine, this new group that they formed, it looks like he's going to go ahead and make sure the Ukraine war keeps getting funded. But the priority for him is Israel, but I don't think that means that they're not going to get the Ukraine aid. The question is, I think, and the debate will be over if they get that big $61 billion that the Biden administration wants to get through, a whole year in Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. quietly expands secret military base in Israel. So this article is from The Intercept, and it says that 2 months before Hamas attacked Israel, the Pentagon awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to build U.S. troop facilities for a secret base it maintains deep within Israel's Negev desert, just 20 miles from Gaza, code-named Site 512. Site 512. The long-standing U.S. base is a radar facility that monitors the skies for missile attacks on Israel. On October 7th, however, when thousands of Hamas rockets were launched, Site 512 saw nothing because it is focused on Iran more than 700 miles away. The U.S. Army is quietly moving ahead with construction at Site 512, a classified base perched atop Mount Har Karen in the Negev, to include what government records describe as a life support facility, which is military speak for barracks-like structures for personnel. Though President Joe Biden and the White House insist that there are no plans to send U.S. troops to Israel amid its war on Hamas, a secret U.S. military presence is already in existence, and the government contracts and budget documents show it is evidently growing. The $35.8 million U.S. troops facility, not publicly announced or previously reported, was obliquely referenced in a August 2nd contract announcement by the Pentagon. This is definitely something that they had the ball rolling on already, and now with all this stuff with Gaza and just the situation in the region, I'm sure that they're going to maybe even ramp this thing up to build it quicker, to get U.S. troops in there. And like they mentioned in this article, this site with all these radars, we're looking at Iran. So now that they think there might be a big regional war and they want to help Israel, protect Israel, again, I could just see them speeding these plans up. All right, so the next one here, Israel is following the U.S. advice in its ground operation. So the big news over the weekend was that it looks like Israel has launched its invasion into Gaza. And a U.S. official told the Times of Israel that Israel's current ground operation in Gaza is in line with the advice the U.S. has been giving. So the official said that Israel has launched a limited ground incursion as opposed to a full-scale invasion, which is what the U.S. recommended to avoid harming hostages, although you have Hamas claiming that 50 hostages have been killed in Israel's airstrikes. I mean, which that's not confirmed. But if they really cared about the hostages, I just wouldn't imagine they'd be bombing Gaza, leveling entire neighborhoods the way that they are. But anyway, so Israel's ground invasion started Friday. They're saying that it's limited, and it does appear, Israeli troops and tanks are in Gaza, just kind of on the outer perimeters right now. It seems like Israel's not releasing much information. Hamas is basically just saying that they're fighting, there's heavy fighting going on. So it's not like they're near Gaza City or anything, but they're kind of taking a slower approach. And this U.S. official said that Israel did not need pressure from the U.S. to launch a limited incursion. And the New York Times reported something similar. They said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin advised a limited ground incursion in talks with his Israeli counterpart, Yoav Gallant. So the Pentagon has also dispatched a 3-star Marine Corps general and other officers to serve as military advisors. This really shows how deeply involved the U.S. is in this war, helping them planning it, so much. So when the Israeli ground forces entered Gaza on Friday, Gaza's phone and internet services were cut, blacking out any media coverage on the ground and making rescue operations significantly more difficult. I follow a few Palestinian journalists in Gaza on Instagram. And, for this time period, everything was cut off for about 34 hours. There was nothing from them. And that's exactly what Israel wants. They don't want the world to see what they're doing there. So services were restored on Sunday morning. I believe still limited. Not sure exactly if it's all fully restored. It's been limited in general, with some communications have been bombed and just in general with the electricity situation. But a U.S. official told the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. had actually convinced Israel to restore Gaza's phone and internet service after shutting it down, so that the UN and aid groups could communicate with their staff inside Gaza. And again, this shows how how much kind of sway the U.S. has over Israel. They act like they can't tell them what to do, but if there are things they want done, they can pressure them to do them, because Israel is very, very reliant on U.S. support right now, especially as they're fearing Hezbollah entering the war. So the U.S. has a lot of leverage. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Saturday that Israel's war in Gaza had entered a second stage, and told Israelis to prepare for a long and hard offensive. Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassem's brigade, said Sunday that its forces were engaged in heavy fighting in northwest Gaza. So while they're saying Israel's ground incursion might be more limited than initially planned, Israeli airstrikes have continued to pound Gaza relentlessly. And they're saying Gaza residents have described the bombardment over the weekend as the most intense yet. They have just been leveling the place. Gaza's health ministry has reported that the death toll since Israel unleashed its bombing campaign has surpassed 8,000, including over 3,000 children. And I know you have Biden questioning the death toll, but the UN is saying that the Gaza's health ministry is generally reliable. And this death toll now is probably pretty low, considering the airstrikes, the communication disruption. Their death toll is based on what hospitals and morgues are recording. Dead bodies come in or people die in the hospital. They record their name, age, and they send them to the main spokesman for Gaza's health ministry. They say it doesn't include people that are buried right after they're killed, and it doesn't include what they think is now thousands of people trapped under rubble. So really horrific. And the amount of children, if you look through that list that they published last week, the amount of children and just like infants, babies, and ages 3, 4, 5, 2 years old, less than 1, it's horrific. There's a mass slaughter of children going on in Gaza right now. And you see how influential the U.S. is over Israel's operations. And they claim they're telling them to avoid civilian casualties, but they clearly don't care. That's clearly not a priority. This is all being entirely enabled by the U.S., by Biden. The next one, we just have the live updates on Gaza from Middle East Eye. The first one here, was about the first one of the stories I went over about the House introducing a standalone bill. Biden says he's committed to ensuring Palestinians in Gaza are not displaced to Egypt. Dozens killed as Gaza under nonstop Israeli bombing. So they're saying dozens of more Palestinians have been killed in the hours between Sunday night and Monday morning. Israeli forces stormed Nablus, so more violence in the West Bank. So the next one here, speaking of the West Bank, Israeli settlers threaten West Bank children with bloody dolls. So there's been a lot of violence in the West Bank, a lot of settler violence, a lot of military violence. But settlers are seeing their opportunity, and they want to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank, out of the territories that they want. And this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says that Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank have distributed threatening leaflets on cars and left bloodied dolls at schools, warning Palestinians to leave or be killed. So if you're watching here, you see the dolls that they left. And one of these leaflets said, quote, "By God, we will descend upon your heads with a great catastrophe soon. You have the last chance to escape to Jordan in an organized manner. After that, we will destroy every enemy and forcefully expel you from our holy land. Load your bags immediately and leave wherever you came from. We are coming," end quote. So the leaflet also warned of a new major Nakba, referencing the 1948 displacement of 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. So in the occupied Al-Marajat area near Jericho, dolls covered in red paint, ostensibly to look like blood and scare young students, were left at the entrance of a school after settlers vandalized it. And I saw, I think it was on Sunday, just an example of the kind of violence and killing that's going on. A Palestinian who was harvesting his olive trees was shot and killed by Israeli settlers. And Palestinian olive farmers in the West Bank pretty frequently get assaulted by settlers during harvest season. They just show up and they beat people up and they terrorize them because they want to push them off the land. And, this is all being done for, a very long time. And the Netanyahu government includes extremist settlers who want to annex the West Bank. And, it's not just that they want to annex the West Bank. They want to get rid of the Palestinians there as well. All right. So the next one here, Israel kills family of peace activist in airstrike. So this is another one from Middle East Eye. Israeli airstrikes killed the family of Gaza peace activist Ahmed Abu Artema. And I put this up. I thought it was notable because this guy is a peace activist. He believes in nonviolent resistance, and he's a poet, and he's considered the inspiration for the Great March of Return, which happened in 2018 and 2019 when Palestinians in Gaza walked towards the fence, and a lot of them were killed by Israeli snipers. Really brutal crackdown on these protests. A few hundred Palestinians were killed. Tens of thousands were wounded. A lot of them were shot with rubber bullets, but a lot of live ammunition was used as well. They killed a few hundred people, including, they shot a guy in a wheelchair that was protesting. They shot journalists. They shot medics. And again, these are snipers. These aren't airstrikes that they say, oh, it's collateral damage. These were Israeli snipers. And there's videos of them, having a great time while they were doing it. The Israeli snipers, I mean. And, there were some protesters throwing rocks and lighting things on fire, but they were unarmed. None of them had guns or anything, and they were just being gunned down. So Abu Artema, he's a poet and writer, and he's suffering from second-degree burns after this airstrike. His son, Abdullah, two of his brothers, and his mother-in-law were killed in this Israeli airstrike. So just an example of, a family, the cost to this one family in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Russia is pushing to encircle the eastern Ukrainian city of make sure I pronounce this right, Avdiivka. So Russian forces are pushing to encircle Avdiivka, which is a city in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast that's about 3 miles north of the provincial capital, as fighting continues to rage along the entire front. So the Washington Post reported on Saturday that Russian forces had advanced to the north of Avdiivka in recent days, and according to South Front, which publishes daily maps of the battlefield situation in Ukraine, Russian forces are also making advances to the south of the city. So if you see this map that I put in here, you see the city of Avdiivka, and it looks like Russian forces are pushing through to make gains. And again, there's fighting going on along the entire front line. I know we haven't been talking about it much, but still very heavy fighting going on in Ukraine. And this is one city it looks like Russia is trying to capture here. It has a pre-war population of 32,000. According to recent reports, it shrunk to just over 1,000, and most of these people are living underground and entirely reliant on humanitarian aid. And because the city is about 3 miles north of the Donetsk capital, that means Russian forces would be in a better position to capture that city if they take Avdiivka. And Ukraine is saying that Russia is taking very heavy casualties in their push for this city. The White House is backing Ukraine's claim, but has also acknowledged that Moscow may achieve some tactical successes in the coming months. So the push on Avdiivka, which began on October 10th, is a sign that Russia is going more on the offensive, as it's clear the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed. Despite the lack of Ukrainian success, the Biden administration is still pushing for $61 billion more to continue funding the proxy war for an entire year. And the U.S. has no interest in a ceasefire. So it looks like Russia is on the offense. It doesn't seem like it's a major offensive, but they're definitely on the offense in certain areas. All right, so the next one here, families of Ukrainian soldiers demand a cap on military service. So this article is from AP, and I thought it was interesting. War-weary mothers, wives, and children of Ukrainian soldiers are demanding a cap of 18 months on mandatory military service amid new suggestions of possible Ukrainian and international weariness with the 20-month war. So this is something that I haven't really thought about. The Ukrainians that were either volunteered or were conscripted in the first phase of the war have been serving, fighting or whatever they're doing in the military for a long time now, over a year and a half. So there's protesters taking to the streets in Ukraine demanding that they limit the service so their family can come home. So the 18-month service limit sought by the protesters would be the same maximum as before the war. It is currently open-ended for draftees. The protesters, who are part of a loose national network, want Ukraine's parliament to consider possible alternatives on service time. So about 100 wives, mothers, children, and relatives of Ukrainian soldiers attended a demonstration in the capital, Kiev. They chanted, "Demobilize the soldiers," and carried banners calling for the return of their loved ones. "Why is dad not coming back?" asked one placard carried by a child. And they interview some wives saying they live in constant fear for their husbands' lives and just the situation. And it says that protesters have also gathered in at least 6 other cities. And when Russia invaded, one of the first things Zelensky did was declare martial law and banned Ukrainian men aged 18 up to 60 from leaving the country. All right, so the last story here, U.S. B-52 encounters a Chinese jet over the South China Sea. So don't worry, they're still trying to provoke China. So the U.S. military has accused a Chinese fighter jet of making an unsafe intercept of a U.S. B-52 bomber that was flying over the South China Sea on October 24th. So U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said in a statement that the Chinese jet came within 10 feet of the American bomber. So that's very close. And according to AP, the U.S. military did not answer questions about what the B-52 was doing flying over the South China Sea. They framed the flight as a routine operation. But again, this is a B-52 bomber. It's not just a surveillance plane. It's also unclear how close the bomber was to mainland China. We don't know exactly where this happened over the South China Sea. China did not confirm the details of the U.S. account, but said that it blames tensions in the region on the U.S. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, "The U.S. military aircraft, which traveled halfway around the world to China's doorsteps to show off military muscle, is exactly the source of maritime and air security risks and dangers to regional peace and stability. China will take resolute measures to safeguard its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity," end quote. So the U.S. frequently flies surveillance planes over the South China Sea, but bomber flights are more rare and obviously more provocative toward China. According to the South China Sea Probing Initiative, which is a Beijing-based think tank, U.S. surveillance planes flew about 1,000 sorties over the South China Sea in 2022, which is a lot. In 1 year, U.S. spy planes flew 1,000 sorties over the South China Sea. I mean, that is a very heavy presence of U.S. spy planes. And it has increased in recent years. So the Chinese think tank also tracked 20 flights of U.S. B-52 and B-1B bombers in the Western Pacific region in 2022 as well. And of those 20 flights, at least 5 bombers entered the South China Sea. So again, it shows how much more rare the bomber flights are compared to the surveillance flights. 2022, 1,000 surveillance planes and 5 bombers. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Dan Steinbach, from Hamas-Israel war to regional escalation with Iran. One from Judge Knapp, Biden, war and the Constitution. One from Doug Bandow, Biden fails to explain why U.S. should fight proxy war against Russia. One from Ramsey Baroud, Human Animals, Sordid Language Behind Israel's Genocide in Gaza. One from William Hartung, Aid for Israel and Ukraine is not a U.S. jobs program. That is everything for me for today. Hopefully everybody had a good weekend. One thing that I'm doing this week on Friday, I'll be on Timcast Friday night, which is a pretty big show, so that'll be cool. See how I do on there. Scott Horton was just on this past Friday. He did a really good job, I thought. I haven't watched the whole. I got to finish watching, but he's definitely got the knowledge. But anyway, so you can always help this show by liking, subscribing, sharing, telling your friends, and all that. That's it for me. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.